Hello, Patchwork Husband here. Welcome to Studio 39 in Baldock. As ever, I am in the classroom. Hang on, what's that? Oh, it's a bit of tumbleweed blowing across, because of course there have been no classes for nearly a year, but we have a vaccine. There's hope in the air. It won't be too long before we've got classes going again. In the meantime, here's the rather delayed part 2 of my Beautiful Batiks, where, if you can remember that far back, I was making a cover for the kitchen mixer. So as promised, here are some ing things. We've got some quilting, some piping and some binding. I think I'll start by doing the back. So I've got my 3 blocks and there's my template, my maquette for the back. The first thing I'm going to have to do is sew these together so that I've got one single block. In the last video I talked about doing sashing. I think I may have been guilty of using the wrong term. What I'm actually going to be doing is putting a border around the block to make it up to the size of the back piece for the pattern. So I'm going to sew those 3 blocks together into one, and then I can show you how we end up with the step pattern that I was talking about earlier. As before, I'm using the pin through the seam method to make sure that the blocks line up properly. So you can see I've got my pin going through the thread line of the seam on both sides of the fabric, and I've got 3 pins doing that, and then we've got pins at the edges just to keep the edges in place. It's important to make sure that you've got the seams running in opposite directions, so this top seam goes that way and the bottom seam goes that way. So I'll sew that up and show you what it looks like. That's it complete. You can see the step design that I was talking about. If I follow it with my finger, you've got a light blue one going down there like that, or the greeny one there like that. That's called a rail fence. Now the next thing I've got to do is put some borders on it so that I can make it up to the size appropriate for my template. Now I've got to decide whether I'm going to put strips across with the hems there, or strips down with the hems there. I think I need to take a little bit of advice. I've taken advice, and the plan is to put a strip the full length of the top and a strip the full length of the bottom, and then we'll just fill in at the sides. Before we do that, in spite of my best efforts, I have to report that there is a little bit of a waviness at the edges of these, so we need to true that up. This requires an expert, so I'm going to subcontract this to somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Now Monica's going to use the right angle lines on the ruler to line the fabric up to get it square, and then cut off the excess fabric to leave us with a nice straight line. Watch and learn, that's what I'm going to do. I have to say, when I see the width of the piece that came off, I did better than perhaps I give myself credit. Hello, Richard speaking. Yes, I really think you ought to put a card in. I'm surely she expects you to put a card in, doesn't she? I'm afraid I had to curtail filming there because somebody had the audacity to ring me. I hope you can see the difference. That's now looking nice and true and rectangular, so now I can do the borders. So I cut a 2-inch strip. Now I can get my fabric clips out again. Hurrah! I'm going to just quickly sew that on, sew the other side, and then I can consider how I'm going to do the 2 remaining sides. So let's sew this quickly. Okay, I thought that concentration was going to make my head burst. I'll give that a press, and onwards and upwards. I said 2-inch, but in fact I need 3-inch strips, so I've sewn those on. So now I've got to trim them. That's best done before you press it, so it will all sit nice and flat for you. And then just get the ruler precisely lined up with the edge of the block and cut off the excess border. So that's one side. So naturally I'm using my fabric clips again. Something else I should point out is that it's easier to do it with the panel, the block on top, and then you can have control over how the seams sit as it goes through the sewing machine, so you get a neater job. So I finished the basic panel that's going to make up the back of my cover. Now I've got to cut it out against my template. I'm not sure how well this works on the camera because I've got a white template on top of a white on white fabric, so it may not be very clear, but this is my template. And I'm going to mark round it with my ceramic lead pencil in a moment. I've just pinned it temporarily to keep it in place. Important to note that I've allowed a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the edge of this. That's to make sure that the cover's not too tight, bearing in mind that we've got piping, wadding and a liner. So rather than leaving a 1/4 inch allowance, I've left a 1/2 inch allowance all the way around, which I hope will mean that it remains not too tight to get it on. So there is my back panel. So now I'll move on to do the front panel. That's going to be a tiny bit more complicated because it's got a dart. Now next on the agenda is the front panel, and this has caused a great deal of gnashing of teeth and angst. How on earth do you deal with the dart? Do you remember we've got this dart here which is to accommodate the pory bit on the mixer? Here's what we decided to do in the end. So the first thing was to make a triangle the shape of the dart, including the seam allowance, and then sew the blocks to it thus, so that when we pull them together the blocks are going to line up. So I'm using this piece of fabric just to anchor them before I pull the dart together. But then of course, to get everything the right shape, I need to cut the borders before I pull the dart in. So the second step is to do the right hand border and the left hand border and sew those on. I briefly contemplated putting the top one on, but then I realised I wouldn't then be able to turn it over to sew this seam to pull the dart in. So that's going to go on second to last, and then very last, after I've done the dart and I've put the top piece on, I'll put a strip across the bottom, which by then would in theory be a straight line. So I'm going to do all that, and if this works, nobody will be more surprised than me. So there we have it. I haven't yet put the bottom piece on because I'll do that when I've finished, to make sure I've got enough fabric. Now the top, if you remember, is going to be 4 of these blocks in a long line, so I'm going to sew the 4 together first and then I'll put the border on. So I've now finished the 3 panels that make up the outside cover. So I've got the bit that goes across the top, down the back and down the front. I've got my back panel and I've got my front panel complete with dart. So now I'm going to turn my attention to wadding and lining. So I've cut my lining fabric and wadding for the back panel. That's easy. I've cut my lining fabric and my wadding for the top and sides. That's easy. But then we've got the front panel with the dart. Now I haven't been videoing this because nobody wants to see a grown man cry, but I think I've got something that's going to work. There's my cover with the dart, we've seen that already. I've cut out the fabric and the wadding using my original template with the dart. I've used my 505 adhesive to spray one to t'other. I've pulled the dart together and pinned it, and with a little bit of jiggery pokery and trimming of wadding, I've now got a dart which corresponds pretty precisely with the one in the cover. So I'll try and put those together to illustrate what I mean. So that fits inside the indentation that we've made to accommodate the bowl and the lifty liddy bit on the mixer. So what I'm going to do now is sew the dart up, and then I can start sewing them together and quilting them. I've used the 505 adhesive to attach the patchwork to the wadding, and the lining fabric, which is calico incidentally, to the wadding. So now I can think about quilting it. I'm going to do a diagonal pattern. In fact, have it as a 60-degree protractor built into the ruler. So if I line up my 60-degree line with the bottom, I get a 60-degree line. So I can use my Hera marker to mark it. I've got my walking foot on the machine. I've got the guide on the walking foot set to achieve a 1-inch gap between the sew lines. So now I can start to quilt it. I've quilted my back panel with my 60-degree diamond pattern. I've used this rather nice Wile Primaries variegated thread. It's very attractive, I think. I don't know if you can see. It's got a nice range of colours. I think it goes rather well with my batiks. So now I've just got to do the others. Now I thought I'd show you how easy it is to go wrong. I'm sewing on the diagonal along this strip which forms the top of my cover, and as before I've used a Hera marker and a ruler to mark the first line. That's all good. However, as I sew along, the straight line becomes less and less straight, so you can see it's already starting to go off there. By the time I get to the end here, it's positively curved. Talk about banana shaped. So why has this happened? Well, let me explain. Because I'm on the diagonal here, when I line up the needle with the previous, no, let's start that again. When I line up the guide with the previous sew line, the guide's not actually touching the fabric. See, we've got a gap there because of the diagonal nature of it. So I've had to estimate where to start sewing. And clearly I'm not very good at this, because I'm constantly estimating too far to the right and ending up with this curve. So I'm going to have to do a lot of unpicking here. This is an example of what my dear old gran used to call lazy people taking the most trouble. She was full of homilies like this. Most of them I didn't understand, to be honest. We had a watched pot called the kettle black, a stitch in time waits for no man, or maybe my memory fails me, I don't know. Onwards and upwards, I'm going to unpick all this and have another go. So I finished that now. That's much more successful than my last effort. That's half an hour of my life I won't get back. So that's the quilting thing completed. Now we'll move on to another ing thing, the piping thing. So that's the fabric I'm going to use for my piping. I need to decide what size piping cord I'm going to use. I've narrowed it down to the 3mm or the 4mm. I think I'm going to go for the 3. I think that's appropriate for the size of the object. So there's been a lot of talk about, or discussion I should say, about whether we need to cut this on the bias. It's a technical term I don't really understand, but I think it means diagonally. That way apparently the fabric has more stretch, but the opinion seems to be that because we're not doing any really sharp corners, I can get away with cutting this any old how, because it hasn't got to stretch all that much. So we're going to put a zipper foot on the sewing machine to accommodate the piping cord and make some piping. I wanted to show you how I've set the machine up to make my piping. First thing I've done is to put a zipper foot on rather than the walking foot I was using for the quilting. What's special about this foot is that it's got a little recess at the side here, which enables the zip, or in this place the piping cord, to pass slightly under the foot, and then the front bit, which presses down, is slightly narrower, so we've got space at the side to accommodate the piping cord. And then by adjusting the needle in this direction, we can get it so that it's nice and tight to the piping cord. I'm using my good old clips to hold it in place before I sew it. I think this will work. It'll certainly save me jabbing myself again, but if it doesn't work, I'll have to resort to pinning it. So we'll give it a try and see if it works or not. I hope this comes out all right on the camera, but that's worked quite well. I'm quite pleased with that. So I've got one length of piping which will go around one side of the cover. I've actually cut inch and a bit strips off the bolt so that I get it nice and long. You can do these things when your wife owns a fabric shop. So I've got another strip, another piece of cord, I'll make another piece of piping, and then my piping is complete and I can sew the cover together. So having made my piping, I can now attempt to sew the cover together. I'm going to be using clips again, very keen on clips. The way I've decided to do this is to lay the piping down so that the seam, the thread line where I've secured the cord inside the piping, is going to be 1/4 inch from the edge of the cover. So I lay that down like that, and then I put this second piece, which is going to form the top, so that it's also 1/4 inch from the thread line. So I've done the first side. There it is. Not too bad if I turn it around the right way. That looks quite smart, doesn't it? So I put the other side on as well, and then we can move on and have a think about the binding. The clips worked extremely well, except at the corners here. Two things about the corners. I had to relieve the binding. I don't know if we can see that here, but you have to make little snips around the corner, otherwise you never get it round. I don't know if you can see there. We've got some snips there, see? And the other thing you have to do is put a pinion at the corner. The clips just aren't sufficiently robust when you're working the thing around the corner. So one pin in each corner, but otherwise I've done that all with the clips. No blood. I have to admit that I have a small confession to make. When I offered up the cover on the mixer, the dart didn't come out quite as well as I expected. To be honest, it looked more like Madonna's bra. So I've remade that panel completely without the darts, and now it's flat. There's my cover all ready to have the binding done. So let's put the binding on. First thing I have to do for my binding is make a strip that's long enough to go all the way around. Unfortunately, that turns out to be more than 44 inches, which of course is the standard width of a bolt. So I will have to join two strips together. How wide should it be? Well, we started by cutting one 1.25 inches, but when you try it, it's a bit too thin and fiddly. So we gave up on that one and did one that is 1.5 inches, and we have to join it together. I've got this prepared to do exactly that. And I know what you're thinking, the idiot's done it wrong. He wants them to be in a line, not at 90 degrees like that. Well, you're right, but let me explain why we're doing it like that. We've done a practice on this piece, and what we're doing is making a seam actually at 45 degrees. So I'll bring that a bit closer so that you can see it. Here's my seam, 45 degrees, and the reason we do that is when you fold it over, as you can see, no part of the seam is touching any other part of the seam, so you don't get a bulge as you would if you had a perpendicular seam, where of course it would be folding in on itself and would be very visible. So that's how you join two strips. So I've got this prepared, it's pinned. I've put the two pieces face to face at 90 degrees, and then I've marked the 45-degree seam. I'm just using these pins to illustrate it in that direction, not that way, so that you've got a little triangle on the outside there, and then when we open it up it'll all line up. So I'll sew that together now. I've sewn my two strips together, and the next thing I've done is to trim it. So I've just cut it off 1/4 of an inch from the stitch line, and then I've pressed the seam flat. That's very important, so that it sits nice and flat on the piece. So what are we going to do with this binding? We're going to do a single binding. What's the difference between a single binding and a double binding, I hear you cry? Well, it's simply the number of layers of fabric. So this is just going to be a single layer of fabric, or a single binding. The way that it's going to work is we'll stitch it onto the cover. Using our 1/4 inch foot, we'll put a stitch line 1/4 inch from the edge, and then when that's on, we can turn it over and tuck it under and sew it on the other side. Now, a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. This seam doesn't want to interfere with any of the piped corners, so we have to make sure that we start it in such a way that the seam appears away from any of the corners. And then we've got to make sure that we don't have a raw edge, so we're going to fold the beginning piece of the fabric over at 45 degrees. And the other reason that we do that is, as before with the other seam, when we join it we won't get a lump. So what I'm going to do is use my fabric clips to clip this on, sew it on, and when we're ready to finish it off on the join here and stitch it on the other side, I'll show you how we do that. So now we've sewn it to the cover, let me just show you what we did where it overlaps. I'll bring it closer to the camera so you can see better. So there's the overlap, and you can see I've stitched just a little bit beyond it up to about there. And now I can cut off this excess piece, and we can turn our attention to taking it over and stitching the other side. The binding's clipped on now. Let me give you a little close-up of what we've done, because it's quite cunning. I've taken a clip or two off so that we can see. If I unfold that, there's another fold in there. So what we've done is we've folded it over once and then folded it over again. And because my supervisor has a bigger brain than me, the width of the strip that we've used means that this piece goes ever so slightly higher than it is the other side. There are lots of ways of doing bindings. This way we're going to be able to, we hope, get away with machining it. Often people hand stitch this side. Well, you've seen what I can do with a pin. Imagine what would happen if somebody gave me a hand needle. So we're going to avoid that, and instead, in theory, if we stitch from the outside right in tight up against the binding, it's going to catch the binding on the other side. Apparently, if you do dressmaking, this is how you'll sew a waistband on. I don't know, I don't do dressmaking, but it seems to make a lot of sense to me. So let's give that a go and see how we get on. Concentration is palpable. There we have it, a mixer cover constructed using Beautiful Batiks in a stripped piece block rail fence design featuring diamond pattern quilting, contrasting piping, contrasting binding. The binding, actually, the seams have come out rather well. So well, in fact, you can't see them easily, so I've had to mark them with pins to quickly find them to show them to you. I'll come a bit closer so that you can see. That is the seam where the two strips are joined together. Sits nice and flat. And that is the seam for the two ends. So not bad. What I'll do now is put it on top of the mixer in the kitchen and take a picture of it and add it onto the end of the video. Before I can do that, of course, I'm going to have to tidy up the kitchen to maintain the illusion that we don't live in a slum. Feast your eyes on that. Thank you for watching. If you found this video diverting, perhaps you'll press the like button or subscribe or even forward it to your friends. Patchwork Husband, over and out.